Welcome to Slaying Excel Dragons video number 3. Hey, we're going to start talking about Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is all about data in Excel, and we'll have a number of videos in Chapter 3. In this video, we're going to cover the pages 25 to 40. We're going to cover data versus information, talk about the SUMIFS, verifying a formula, verifying data are correct, and then we'll look at a pivot table. This video is just about how do we go from raw data to information, and we'll see the SUMIF in the pivot table. Just a basic SUMIF and pivot table in this video. Later chapters will have chapters just on formulas, functions, and data analysis for pivot tables. Hey, in this video, let's start with a small data set, raw data. Here's a piece of raw data. The date. Here is a piece of raw data, the sales rep, and here are the units sold on this date. Each one of these pieces of data, this 10, for example, is an example of raw data. Now in Excel, we keep our data with field names or column headers at the top and records in rows. So each one of these is a record that represents one transaction. All right, so how do we go from raw data to information? Well, why do we even have to do that, right? Most of what we do in the business world is we have a bunch of raw data and we need to make information. But why do we have to make information? We make information from raw data so we can make decisions. So for example, in this simple example, that's a piece of raw data, but what we really need is we need to see if Sue, the sales rep Sue, met the weekly quota of 20 units sold. All right, so if we could take this raw data and calculate Sue's total for the period here, for the week, then we have some information that we can use to make a decision. The decision will be yes, we met the weekly quota, or no, we didn't. All right, again, in this video, we'll do raw data into information using the SUMIFS function and then a pivot table. So I'm going to click in this cell right here. I'm going to start off. This is a formula, and as we saw in our last video, formulas start with an equal sign. Always the first character in the cell. As soon as you do that, you're telling Excel, I am doing a formula. Now we're going to type the name of a function. We did this, created a function last video with a keyboard shortcut, but now I'm going to type S, and notice, wow, a drop down to select. So I'm going to type U, M. Now, typing out a function like this as part of your formula assumes you know the name of the function. Later, we'll see how to search for a function. Now notice I see a drop down and I see the function I want, SUMIFS. So I'm going to down arrow. Notice what happens. Not only we can go down this list when we see what we want. Arrow key shows the SUMIFS. That's the one I want. Notice also if I look over here, that's a screen tip that tells us what this function does. Adds the cells specified given a set of conditions or criteria. That's what we want because we don't want individual pieces of raw data. We want it to add with a criteria Sue. So it will add up all of Sue's sales. Now once you select an item in this dropdown, these are all functions, you can simply hit Tab. Now, this pops up a screen tip. The screen tip shows arguments. And sometimes you can figure out how to use a function like this from its arguments. Other times you can't. If you click on this, that's called a hot link. It'll take you to help, and it will explain this. Still further, I'm going to show you here, but we're not going to use it. You could click up here, and it opens up a Insert Functions dialog box, which has more description than just the screen tip. But for us, we're using SUMIFS, and this just adds given one or more condition. Now right now it says the sum range. Well, that's the range we want to add. So I'm simply going to take my cursor and click and drag. Notice bold, that means the function is expecting an input for sum range. We've given it that input. I'm going to type comma. Now the criteria range. And then the next argument is criteria. Now, there is an alternative. In earlier versions, there was a SUMIF, but the screen tip wasn't quite as polite, and so people will get confused with this. Now, we could be using that earlier function, but we're not. And the reason why is the screen tip explanation, these names of each argument really tell us exactly what we need. Well, where is the range with all the criteria? It's right here. The names. And we're going to tell it to look for all the Sues. So I'm going to highlight this. All right. Bold, that means we've entered that. You type a comma to get to the next one. Now, criteria 1, we typed a comma. Now, I need to click right there, but because it's so close, I'm going to do like we did last video and use the arrow key. Now, I can use the arrow key to get my cell reference. Notice it says enter right here. So as long as I see that, I can arrow. That was a left arrow, and it puts it in. You can also arrow when you see point mode down here. Now, what's nice about point mode is if you accidentally arrow too far, or for that matter, if you click in a cell that's incorrect, as long as you see point and the dancing ants are still dancing, you can go ahead and edit it. So in this example, I arrowed 2 times, and I only meant to do it 1. So now I'm going to right arrow to go back. There's our criteria. We're using the SUMIFS function to create information from our raw data. I'm going to close parentheses and Control Enter. So we have created our information from raw data, and now we can use that information to make our decision. Did Sue meet the weekly quota? Information, our decision, the answer is no. Sue did not make the weekly quota. So throughout the rest of this book, we will have lots of raw data. And sometimes we'll be making calculations like a payroll calculation, where it's just math and we're calculating a number answer. Lots of other times we'll be doing this. We'll be taking raw data and creating information so we can make a decision. Now, next part of this video before we look at the pivot table is when you create a formula. I'm going to click here and hit F2. It is your job, if you're in charge of the spreadsheet, to make sure it works correctly. So with this cell selected, I'm going to click F2 and just look. I can see everything's pointing to the right areas. It looks like I'm calculating correctly. So I've actually checked the formula itself. Just is it pointing in the right place? Control Enter. Now I want to verify if it's calculating correctly. Now, here's a great trick. For a small data set, we can use this trick just to prove to ourselves that the formula is correct. Larger data sets, there's other ways to verify. But watch this. Sue, Sue, Sue. Really, we want to add that, that, and that. Well, click in this cell, and I would like to do this. Now, how in the world did I do that? I selected and highlighted cells not next to each other. Well, when you click in the first selection, before you click in the second one, you simply hold Control. Boop. And then I'm still holding Control. Boop. No way. Now, down here on the status bar, by default, there are some functions. You can change this by right-clicking and then choosing which function you want. I'm going to click Escape. No way. Average, count, and sum. So it shows us a sum of 15. So it looks like, boom, our method, since we're in charge of this spreadsheet, it looks like we're verifying, and sure enough, it is 15 down here. All right, now let's check it again. Right? That was how to verify a formula. Not only looking at the formula, but doing our little control trick in the status bar. Let's change it to Tina and see if we can create information for Tina and check it against our weekly quota. So I'm going to type Tina. Control Enter. Notice I didn't have to hit delete, which is a thing that people do commonly. Control Z to undo. You just type. If that cell is selected, if you type something, it replaces it. Control Enter. All right. So I'm going to do the same trick. Control and select. Uh-oh. Looks like she met, according to the status bar, she met the weekly quota, but our formula doesn't work. All right, here's how you do it. When you verify a formula, you, in essence, work backwards through the formula. F2, you look at the formula first. And then if all of the inputs into our functions, the ranges look correct, then there's got to be a problem not with the formula, but the data. So I'm going to click in this cell and hit F2. I'm checking the criteria. That looks good. Escape. Now I'm going to click here and hit F2. That looks good. T-I-N-A. Now I'm going to click here and hit F2. Looks good. Now I'm going to click here and hit F2. Boom. So anytime you have a formula that's looking at the right ranges and it's not giving you the right answer, you have to suspect that it is the raw data itself that is causing the problem. And there it is. That's a very important lesson. TINA space is not considered the same thing by Excel as, when I click here, F2, TINA. 4 characters, 5 characters. Now watch this. Escape. I'm going to click here, F2. Backspace. As soon as I do that, this is going to be counted now by the SUMIFS. One last thing about the SUMIFS before we move on to our pivot table. I want to click F2. Here's what happens behind the scene, and we'll see this a lot through the rest of the book here. What does the SUMIFS do? Well, we told it to have the sum range. But then when it looked through the green range here, this B2 to B7, and it's searching for Tina, it goes like this. True. In here, this case, it's Tina. So false, true, false, true, false, true. So every time it sees a true, it goes over and grabs this and puts it into his memory. True, put it into memory. True, put it in the memory. When it has 9, 8, and 3, it then adds. We'll see this idea of formulas checking to see whether something meets a criteria. And it always says, is it true or is it false? All right, I'm going to click Escape. All right, now let's look at a pivot table. Now, I'm on the sheet SUMIFS. If I want to go to the sheet PT, I can either click on it with my cursor right there or Control Page down. Oh, here's a little bit bigger data set. What I would like to do is, instead of like we did over here, Control Page up, just a single name and the total, and then have to change the criteria here, I want to do it, Control Page up. I want to do it just like automatically and list Sue, Tina, and Chin, and just have their totals. Now, I'm going to show you how to do a pivot table to take raw data and create information. This is one of the most powerful tools in Excel to create information, to make decisions from raw data. Now, if you've ever heard of a pivot table, you've probably heard something false. I always hear from people in the working world, students, even other teachers, they always say pivot tables are hard. Forget it, they're not. They are one of the easiest things. And here's the trick. Just envision the end result first and look at it, and then making a pivot table is easy. So here's the data set. I just drew a little picture. Like, all I want is to see Sue, Tina, Chin, and then their totals listed over here. Now look at how this is set up. This is, we have our field names at the top, but there's a name and a total. And then we jump down one row, a name and a total. Notice that these are, in essence, row headers, and then there's our information. There's our criteria as a row header, and then in the row next to it is the number we want. That's a value. That's a calculation a value we're calculating. All right? So I know that seems silly to picture the table, but if you picture the table in advance, pivot tables are easy. And actually, we'll see lots of examples. We have like 25 pages later in the book just on pivot tables. All right, rule number 1, when you're doing pivot table, field names are in the first row. So you actually have to name each column. And then records are in rows. Then you click in a single cell. And you would think that since pivot tables are a data analysis feature, you go to the data ribbon. In earlier versions, they actually used to be on the data menu. But that's not where it is. They put it under Insert. All right, so one cell selected. Don't do this, because then the pivot table gets confused. Click on one cell, go to Pivot Table, and then click on that. Now, I'm going to show you an alternative. If this ends up being what you do every day in your job, which lots of people do, we're going to use the Alt keyboard shortcut. So Alt, and then N is for Insert. V is for pivot table, and T is for table. And then there's a one-step wizard here. Because we had our data set up with field names at the top and records and rows and no blanks, and our entire data set was surrounded by blanks. Remember, we talked about Control asterisk to select a table. Because our data was set up like that, it guessed right. I'm going to not put my pivot table on a new sheet, but later we'll see how to do that. I'm going to say I want my pivot table on an existing sheet and click right there. Now I'm going to click in F1. for starting the pivot table, that's it. In earlier versions, 2003 and before, you actually had 3 steps to this wizard. But forget it. In 2007 and 10, just one, click OK. Now remember, I told you if you envision it in advance, it's easy. Now, it's kind of scrunched up here, so I'm going to use my scroll arrow. Now notice they kind of are polite here. They show a picture like with row headers and column headers. We're just going to use row headers. And then it's suggesting that you just take this list of field names and check the ones you want. OK, so let's see. I wanted sales rep. Look at that. Just like that, it went through this entire list over here and gave me a unique list, which means a single occurrence of each one. And I don't know, we wanted to sum, so I'm going to click that. You got to be kidding. Is that amazing? Now, by default, if they're text, they get plopped into what's called the row labels. And if they're numbers or values, they get put into the values. Now, remember I told you about envisioning your table in advance? If you didn't really get it, and I'm going to uncheck these, you could guess that, oh, yeah, row labels is where I wanted my names. And values, that's the thing I'm calculating, right? There's that symbol for sum sigma. So you could actually click. And if it didn't go to the right place, you just drag it. You can drag it wherever you want. That's why it's called a pivot table. You can see what happens up here. But we want it in row labels. You could also drag like this. And when you see it, you just drop it. All right, 2 things. We'll get into great detail of pivot tables later, but I don't like this row label, so I'm going to go up to design. Ooh, these are context-sensitive ribbons. So far, we've seen the regular standard ribbons, the one we added with a check in the customize ribbon area, and then we created our own ribbons, right? But now these are context-sensitive ribbons. That means if I click out here, they go away. But if I click inside the pivot table, whoa, they show up. Not only that, one other thing. Sometimes this doesn't appear. Just right-click inside the pivot table and say, oh, show field list. All right, so let's go to design. 2 things. Row labels is the default in 2007 and 2010. It's just terrible. So you have to remember to go to report layout and say show in tabular. You just got to remember that tabular. Again, we'll do that like many times later in the chapter on pivot tables. There it is. Sales rep and sum of units sold. Absolutely perfect what I want. If you want to do some formatting, you could click the More button. Usually the formatting, some of it's pretty funky, but there we go. Now, we have been talking about keyboard shortcuts. And so although that was pretty amazingly fast there, I would like to show you how to create the same pivot table on a new sheet. Now, let's come over. And with keyboard shortcuts, meaning we'll be able to do this in less than 5 seconds. Now, I'm going to do it slow at first, and then I'll do it a little bit faster. I'm going to click in one cell in the data set, and our keyboard shortcut is Alt-NVT. Notice, by default, this is highlighted down here, this kind of OK. It's got that shadow. So that means if you hit Enter, it'll put it by default on a new sheet. And then I click. Right? So I'm going to delete this and do this again. I'm going to right-click Sheet 3 and point to Delete. OK, you ready? Alt-NVT, Enter. Click. So if you had your watch on, if I didn't miss that first click, maybe it was like 5 seconds. And we have our information created with a pivot table from our raw data. Now I'm going to be sure and name this sheet. I want to call this Pivot PT2. You can't rename a sheet. I double-clicked it. Now I'm typing. You can't give it the same name. Right? Totally amazing. So in this video, we saw a lot of what we're going to do in Excel is taking raw data, individual pieces of raw data, and creating information. We saw the SUMIFS. We saw how to audit formulas and make sure, verify that our formulas are working correctly, both the formula inputs and the data itself. And then we saw absolutely most powerful data analysis feature, the pivot table on a sheet and on a new sheet. Now, in our next video, we'll talk formally about the structure of how data has to be set up in order for us to do most of the things we want. All right, let's take a look now at the homework workbook. This is Slaying Excel Dragons homework chapters 1 to 9. You can download this from the link directly below the video. We have, in our first couple of videos, done homework problems 1 to 4. Now I'm going to scroll ahead. Now, chapter 3, pages 25 to 40, there's homework problem number 5 with the answer, problem number 6 with the answer, etc. So there's 8 homework problems. All right, we'll see you next video.